Did someone else do that?
I did, Katie.
Okay, because I was trying to find it. So, okay, good. Thank you. Is that going to record on yours?
No, it's recording to the cloud.
I'm not sure how to access that. So, okay. All right, Denny,
Welcome,
I think
everyone.
we're ready. Yep, sorry.
Yep, I'm ready to get started. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'm Denny Brennan from the Massachusetts Health Data Consortium, and I want to welcome you to today's MHDC Executive Forum on the road to interoperability. Before we introduce our forum co-chairs and our guest experts, let me go over a few housekeeping items with you. Today's session will be an hour in duration, but there will be an additional 30 minutes afterwards to continue the discussion or answer additional questions with members of the MHDC staff and among those guests who are able to stay for the extra time. We really welcome participant engagement. This is a forum, not a webinar in the traditional sense of the word. We like the give and take, the back and forth between interested parties, and we will be looking to see your hands raised or your speaking up, unmuting your microphone and speaking directly, or using the chat feature, or I'm sorry, the Q&A feature. We're going to go with the Q&A feature rather than the chat feature because we want to be able to see your questions. Some of those questions we'll be able to answer with you directly. Others will pose to our panelists, but we encourage you to be actively engaged in what we do. This meeting is being recorded and it will be available on our website in about a day's time. And at the end of the presentation, there will be, or the end of our discussion, there will be a survey, a brief survey. We appreciate your feedback upon leaving the session so that we can do what we can to improve these going forward. Now, let me introduce our co-chairs for the 2023 Executive Forum Series. MHDC board members David Carusio from Point 32 Health, where he serves as the Chief Technology Officer, and William Young, the Chief Information Officer at Berkshire Health Systems. David, why don't we take an intro from you first?
Thank you, Denny. I'm happy to be here. As Denny said, I'm Vice President and Chief Technology Officer of Point 32 Health. Happy to be here and joining the session. I want to welcome everybody online. We have a great session for you. Very interested to hear what Patrick and Lorraine have to say. The Executive Forum has been a very fruitful and positive experience over the last 6 months. We've had a lot of really good speakers, and I know that today's will be no exception. We'll have a really good conversation. Thank you all. Bill?
Good morning, everyone. I am Bill Young, the Chief Information Officer for Berkshire Health Systems. I want to also welcome you to this exciting webinar with these experts from government and industry. Interoperability. We all know this has been and is an incredible journey. This monthly executive forum has been very engaging and valuable for providers, payers, government, and industry to come together and discuss how we continue to make this journey successful. Again, welcome, and back to you, Denny.
Thank you both. And now, let me tell you a little about today's session, and especially about our guests and our experts who are joining us today. The road to interoperability is paved with a lot of different bricks, if you will. And among them is that this is more than a technology journey. This is a journey where people's work will change, where organizational culture will change to accommodate and succeed under the accelerated demands of interoperability, which are pushing us closer and closer to real-time data availability, real-time support for clinical and business workflows, and creating a culture where agility and speed are of the essence. Therefore, let me just also now tell you a little bit about our guest experts. Lorraine Du is a senior policy advisor for the Health Informatics and Interoperability Group in the Office of Burden Reduction and Interoperability at the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS. Lorraine develops regulations and supports industry implementation of federal policies on interoperability and standards to support data exchange in healthcare for patients, providers, and payers. Patrick Murta is the Chief Technology Officer at BeHaVR, a leading virtual reality digital therapeutics company with a behavioral health focus. Patrick leads the BeHaVR platform and associated teams, which translate proven science into effective and engaging virtual reality therapeutics for mental and behavioral health. Patrick came to BeHaVR from Humana, where we have known and worked with Patrick for some time, where he spent 23 years providing leading healthcare solutions. Most recently at Humana, Patrick served as the Chief Interoperability Architect and Fellow. Over his career, Patrick has architected and implemented leading healthcare solutions, including a CIO 100 award winner in 2020. He recently co-authored a FHIR interoperability implementation guide, which HL7 approved for trial use in 2022. Now, allow me to move us forward. We are going to be asking 3 questions of our guests today for the remainder of this hour. And how we are going to go about this process, as we have done in our previous forums, is we're going to pose a question to our guest experts, get their input, their feedback, their responses to those questions. And then we're going to turn to you as our audience to get your perspectives and issues that you see arising with these questions. And then we'll go to a second question, and then finally a third question. Again, the idea being to stimulate discussion and to encourage a back and forth between our audience, our panelists, and MHDC. So, starting, Lorraine, with you, I'm going to ask question number 1. When we move to interoperability and we look at the impact on organizations, what are some of the major supports and support services that people will need to implement interoperability successfully and stand up the FHIR exchange services?
Thank you. Well, we talked about these questions in advance because I'm coming at it from a policy perspective of, here we're asking you all to do these innovative activities of putting in, patient exchanges or provider exchanges or payer exchanges to make sure that people have access to their information. So what is this FHIR exchange services? So what are the support services that organizations need to implement to successfully stand something up? So as I was thinking about it is, well, support comes in many forms. And when I think about support services and anything that I've ever had to implement before, who are all the other components of an organization that have to back me up or anyone else up on, on a mission from a business perspective? What are all of the other business areas that have to be involved? Because it's not just a technical issue. And I know that's probably familiar to everyone, but what are the other operational areas that are impacted? So it may be the data centers and the enterprise architects and the analysts, but it's also communications. It's also contracting. It's also the workforce, as you mentioned in your first statements. Who are all of the other areas that are going to be impacted, and do they already know what's coming for them? So sort of taking a landscape view of all of the other areas of the entity that are going to be impacted by it and what's going to change for them. And do they know how their work is going to change and what kind of training do they need? Because that's part of the first phase. And we've been looking at that at CMS and bringing in training of, do you even have the right vocabulary? Can you even have a conversation when you go into meetings And are you just talking at people saying, we're going to implement this fire server or this new data exchange without even having the right vocabulary to have a conversation? So I think that's the kind of support that people need to implement, it is getting the vocabulary right and those kinds of training and support services across all of those baseline operational services. And then I'll add to this and then ask Patrick is the story that an executive then needs to hear when you're saying, we want to do this great, good, wonderful thing, is that you have alignment within those different divisions that have to offer the support for implementing that fire server, that everyone is on board with their different divisions and that they're willing to help support that implementation. Because without knowing that you have support from all those other organizations within your organization, for that use case, if you will, for that new innovation, you won't have that alignment for when they go and talk with other areas to say, should we be doing this? There won't be that buy-in. And so it's got to come from all of that collaboration and cooperation, which personally I think is key.
Thank you, Patrick.
Yeah,
From your
just to build-
perspective.
yes, and Lorraine did a great job providing that overview there. Let me start by saying that thinking about interoperability, especially fire, needs to be an enterprise mindset, right? We tend to think of this as a technical implementation, which part of it is, but fire and associated technologies are much more than just technical. So keep that in mind. So things to keep in mind, having implemented fire both at really large organizations and now currently at a relatively small organization, there are a couple of key things to keep in mind. First of all, it's good to have folks that are knowledgeable in the standards. For example, the HL7 standards, the fire standards, implementation guides that are moving through HL7, Da Vinci, Fire at Scale Task Force, the Cairn Alliance, that type of thing. Understand where things are going from an overall industry perspective so that you can align, influence, and be involved in that piece of it. Another key thing is, of course, understanding the technology, but that transparently is becoming almost a commodity, right? When I first started doing fire many, many years ago, I'm not going to admit exactly when that was, but it's been a few years, fire was novel, right? So, pre 1.0, we were creating our own fire servers and doing things like that. But technology, you've got all the major cloud providers and other organizations have off-the-shelf implementations. So the focus on delivering, APIs and that type of thing, the burden is much less than it was even a couple of years ago. So you do need some expertise there, but you don't need necessarily the underlying engineering capability of building a fire server, since those are, able to partner with folks and basically get those as part of cloud offering. I would but maybe put a lot of focus on understanding the data. So having implemented, fire, one of the key things that you don't want to overlook is that most organizations have years, in some cases decades, of data that either from a regulatory perspective or from an operational perspective is best served up through fire, right, as a business enabler. So understanding folks or having folks who understand the current data architecture, what the data means in your organization, some of those, databases that have been running for 10 years or whatever, and everybody just, crosses their fingers and they're happy when the system is up the next day. Understanding what that underlying data is all about, how it flows through the ecosystem of the organization, and how you can manifest it in a fire server so that you can exchange information across the ecosystem. And also when you're getting information back, how do you not just bring it to the fire server, but make sure it's benefiting the organization, and most importantly, patients and members. That's key. Not just the exchange of data, but understanding how the data plays in your organization and how it can be, democratized and liberated from its existing platforms. A close, fast follow on that is data governance, right? And this is an issue that a lot of organizations run into, because when you're liberating and democratizing that much data, especially in really large organizations, having data governance is really, really key, because you're unlocking information that may have been in a siloed system for many, many years, and your UM system or your claim system or whatever the case may be. But in this world, it's interacting with other information. So making sure that you're governing data is really, really key. Another key thing, and this one, takes some organizations a little bit by surprise, is most organizations have some support model. Something goes wrong, you password reset or whatever. There's a phone number to call. But in this model, especially with the regulations, if there's something in the data that doesn't look right, you need a path to get to not only a customer support person, but a mechanism to make sure that somebody that understands the data can go look at this and do we actually have a data problem or what is the case may be. I know that sounds really easy, but in implementations that I've been involved with, having that successful path from, hello, this is the support organization, to this data, made it to the fire server, but it started over there, and how do we fix it at that point or look at it is really, really key. And, operationalizing that. So again, I could go on and on, but I know that we've got limited time, but those are some of the key things from my experiences that are really, really important when you're getting into the world of contemporary fire-based exchange.
One of the things that comes to mind, as both of you have addressed this question, is that the whole notion of support changes. Support used to be, tech support. Over there, come help me, as you said, Patrick, reset my password or fix something on my computer that isn't working. But you are also talking about people who understand the data. And this means support becomes much more of a front office rather than a back office part of the organization, able to address not only underlying technical issues, but have to be able to address meaning issues, semantic issues about data. What do they mean? Why do I have information that I haven't had before? Lorraine, could you talk a little bit about, this idea of support being closer to the user, the actual data user, and how that might manifest itself in your experience in an organization or as part of making a transition like this?
Well, this I think was when I was when we were thinking about this of how the data now is going to be manifested. So this customer support, but it's the customer support also, I think, as you're alluding to, for now, whether it's the internal staff who are going to be getting different data and understanding the data they have, but it's also, and I think this is what your question is asking, is a patient or another provider having new data or looking at it. And this is what I was referencing in the vocabulary and understanding what it is making sure that they understand what they may have been seeing before on their screen, or let's say a patient on their phone, is what that means and how it's been translated and how they interpret it. So is it, in meaningful ways, and how they interpret it. And that's why it's so important to have all of the staff understanding what it is and what they're seeing, so that they can help interpret it, or they have someone that they can go to make sure that they have a way of doing that. And that's why the vocabulary is so important, is this right data point the same as it was before? And can they translate it, or do they know how to go and make some translation for it? But yes, that's what's critically new about this new pathway. And it should be easier to understand what that information is, but also now who owns that data. So it came in from one place, something's happened to it, and now it's in another place. So who has responsibility for that? And that's part of the discussion that has to happen in the organization.
Great, thank you. Patrick, any thoughts from you on that particular aspect?
Just a few other comments on that is, so, to build on what Lorraine said, one of the things that we see, especially, and I'll use the patient access API as an example, is that in that model, payers become aggregators of information across the space, right? Whether it be from EHRs, in many cases, you're deriving clinical data from administrative data. Claims turn into ICD-10 codes and CPTs and those types of things. So this information is abundant, right? And the velocity of the data is ever increasing. So in some of those models, you'll get a patient accesses their data on their phone. And, I've never had this condition before in my life. I'm going to call my payer and ask why they're saying that I've got epilepsy. I'm making that up, and understand that. So having people who can deal with that from a human perspective, because that could be a difficult conversation. Hey, payer, why are you representing my data? I don't have epilepsy. So the human part of it, which can be different than a purely, hey, you didn't pay my claim correctly, or Is this doctor network versus you said something that is not, should be not part of my medical record? That's a different type of conversation. And then tracing that back through the organization and potentially to an external organization, whether it be a provider or payer to payer or whatever, where that information derived from. So in many ways, it is a more complex support model, which requires a support infrastructure and a support, I don't know what the right term is, a support concierge or whatever, interaction that is at a whole different level. And that's something that a lot of people a lot of organizations are unprepared for, right? Because when you're liberating, aggregating that much data, you're pressure testing things that transparently have never been pressure tested in healthcare as all of this data starts coming together.
And
Thank
can I
you,
add on
Janice.
to that?
Oh, go ahead, Laura. Go ahead, Lorraine.
And because we haven't gotten to this question yet, but to add on to what Patrick's saying is that the support services are very different, because if a person calls in, and again, as Patrick was saying, or someone said at the beginning, we don't have a lot of known utilization from the patient access API on the payer side yet. And we certainly haven't had any calls from someone saying either I can't get my data or there's a problem with the data. We have not heard that. But the infrastructure to support such a call, where a customer service representative would have the script to say, I know what to do with that, because the data, as Patrick's saying, is it's administrative data being translated now into something more clinical, is a whole different question that a customer service person who's handling hundreds or thousands of calls a day has to know where that goes, because the genesis of the data is somewhere else. It belongs to someone else. And that whole flow is a completely different workflow.
Well, that ties to a question that Janice Karen has to ask, I think on behalf of one of our audience members. Janice, would you like to pose your question?
Sure. So I'll just make my quick thing first, and then we'll go to the audience question. So one thing that struck me while both of you were talking is this idea. People have a tendency not to think about APIs as real products. They're something separate because they're technical. But I think that's the key to everything that you've been talking about. And I'll give you one example which struck me while Patrick was talking. One piece that's often missing on the data side and understanding the data is actual documentation about how an implementation guide was implemented, or what a specific property inside a resource actually means, and how it maps to your other data if you've been using it through other means. So I don't know if either of you want to comment on that, but I think that that's a good way to encapsulate a lot of what you've been talking about, and feel free to disagree with me if that's the case. I'll give you a moment to respond to that.
Yep, I could jump in, Lorraine, and then you can feel free to add. So Janice, I think you hit the nail on the head, and it pains me that somebody would not think of an API as a product, because it is, right? And the associated data, right? This is not just a technical implementation. These are products that help change healthcare for the better, remove burdens, provide better member and patient experiences, and better outcomes. So when we think about APIs, like you think about building any product, the underlying data, the translation, the conversion, the support is the underlying infrastructure that may manifest itself in a relatively simple API, but understanding how that product comes together, and the fact that that product can be associated with other APIs to create different products, like longitudinal histories and member summaries and other types of things, is really, really key to the component here. Again, the support is really, really key. But I would caution folks, and I know that I sound like a broken record because I say this all the time, if you are not thinking of your data and your API as products that can benefit your organization, and more importantly, benefit your patients and members, then you need to have a serious discussion about what your enterprise strategy is. Because those that don't think that way, in my humble experience, are going to increasingly have difficulty interacting with others in healthcare, especially in value-based care models, and potentially risk the future growth of their organization. Lorraine.
I'm actually writing down what you said.
I was doing the same thing. I was getting that down. One of the questions this raises, though, is, as you mentioned, Patrick, and Lorraine, you mentioned this also, is these data don't necessarily come from the enterprise. They don't originate in the enterprise. They originate in an ecosystem. They could be patient originated. They could be provider, a specific physician, a specific provider organization, a health plan. And people are going to come to support services and say, where did you get this data? And the question of provenance suddenly becomes, and we've talked about this for a number of years now, which is we're dealing with a soup of data that is a combination of data from multiple sources, where individual data elements need to be associated with their source, their provenance. Can you talk a little bit about provenance and its importance in this regard and how that might change support services? Lorraine, I'll start with you, and then Patrick, I'll go to you.
Well, and I think we've been circling around it probably about is the provenance, and it's been a discussion point for a long time. And I will have to confess, I'll go back many years ago when we have first started talking about this concept of giving people access to their data. We were involved in a PHR pilot actually in Utah at CMS. I'm not even going to say, like Patrick, I'm not saying how long ago it was. But where the individual could pick the kind of personal health record that they wanted, and whether it was tied to a sort of a desktop, if you will, just directly from the provider, or if it was going to be cloud-based, because at that point, the APIs were not even a vision, if you will. And it was really then who owns responsibility for that data, where did it come from, and how would patients feel about data coming from different sources versus just directly from their provider, or being a soup, if you will, from many different, and then who had responsibility for it. And that's kind of what we were alluding to. So this provenance and how you tag that, and then when there's a problem with it, to whom do you go back to fix it? Because if, let's say it's for ours, if it's coming from the payer, but the payer has had it sourced from somewhere else, who has responsibility for going back and then fixing it? A payer cannot fix data that they got from somewhere else. They can only send the patient back to say, this was on a claim. And then how was that claim translated? So the provenance is important because you have to be able to go back and find out where it came from, but it may have been correct in how it was sent in for the purposes for which it was sent in. So I don't know that we're certainly not going to solve that issue here, but it is important to tag, where it was sourced and the purpose for which it was used when it was that data, because it could have been correct, but it may have been a rule out. And I know I'm way oversimplifying it. The doctors on the call are probably going to kill me. But that's, for the purpose of what the data may have said at the time it was submitted, and the responsibility, therefore, of an individual to have to go back to say, please help me understand what this is and how I'm to use it.
Yep, and just to add maybe a little bit more of a tactical lens to what Lorraine was saying there, is that when we were standing up or testing out or building our 9115 patient access API, right, is that, and I love FHIR, I love interoperability. The one thing that concerned me was provenance, right? Knowing how legacy systems flow data, I knew that there could be some hiccups there, right? Not hiccups, but potentially some challenges, because in the way certain data flows through large organizations, it obviously comes in with an NPI or some identifier or whatever, OID or whatever. But at certain points for operational systems, that information may be disassociated, right? So this becomes part of data governance, because to Lorraine's point, much of the information that comes in and is served up via FHIR is aggregated from other sources, right? That's the beauty of the model. You get a concise picture, point in time representation of a patient. And remember, understanding that data in today's world, which is so obvious, but for those who have been around a while, it maybe wasn't obvious 30 years ago when we were building claims and systems, is making sure that provenance is attached and flowing through the entire ecosystem is really, really key. Fortunately, my concerns were a little bit overplayed, and it was not near as big of an issue as I was concerned it was going to be. And it's become really key, to Lorraine's point, is when somebody calls in and say, why do you say I have this condition? Oh, it's, Dr. Do or whatever, you might want to address this with them, that type of thing. So when you're building your infrastructure, and not just to meet the regulations, it's good practice to be able to say where data came from, but sometimes that was missed in legacy systems, is to make sure your data governance process enforces that. And if not, the data governance organization has the ability to say, we've got to fix this because we have the chain of trust from a provenance perspective. If it's broken anywhere, it's not good. You've got to make sure the chain of trust of provenance from receipt through delivery is intact.
Excellent. Thank you both for that. That was a very, very fruitful and I thought very informative discussion. Why don't we move on to our next question? What are some of the more important non-technical issues people need to consider when standing up fire server? We've talked about some of this already, but there are some other ones that I'm sure that we're going to get into. And what are some of the non-technical roles? Patrick, you referenced a concierge, or a person in, a more front of enterprise as opposed to the back of the enterprise role. What are some of the non-technical roles who should be involved in interoperability projects? Can you talk about that, Patrick? I'll start with you, and Lorraine, then I'll go to you. Who becomes part of your interoperability team, apart from those who are the engineers, the architects, and the technologists familiar with the underlying technology? Who else do you need to have on your team?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And the obvious ones, I've talked about it, we've talked about it already, is data governance and data experts, because you've got to understand where the data is in the organization and what it actually means. You'd be surprised. The data at rest, there are only a few handful of folks in the organization that may know what that field means. So that's really, really obvious. We talked about support processes, so I won't go much into there. Understanding business subject matter experts. So you've got data experts that understand where the data is flowing and that type of thing, but having true business experts that understand how that data is used in the organization is really, really key, right? Because as you're standing up your infrastructure and meeting not only regulatory components, but operational efficiencies with fire and, just real-time integration, understanding how the data is used in the organization is key, right? Because once you understand the benefactors of the data, designing solutions and implementing things becomes much, much easier, right? So having data subject matter experts. And for me, probably the most critical piece is having folks who understand from a business and operational perspective how interoperability use cases or what the true interoperability use cases are. And I'm not talking about the base ones. I'm not talking about just meeting the base of the regulatory. I'm talking about folks that understand with the real-time flow of data, right? Right data, right place, right workflow for the right outcome, how those use cases can change an organization in its entirety, right? Enterprise mindset. So folks that are understanding, well, if I get this piece of information, I can automate prior authorization and take 10 minutes off a process, right? That type of thing, which actually is a true use case that we did at Humana, right? And other types of things. How do we understand that these APIs as a product, like Janice was saying, and data as a product in a truly standard format across organizations, internally and externally, what use cases can we bring to bear with this new data or this new technology that transforms organizations and transforms healthcare? Because if you don't understand the use cases at a high level, an enterprise level, or even at a department level, you're building fit for purpose only solutions. I'm going to solve problem Y. And when problem X comes, I'm going to solve problem X, as opposed to, wow, I've got a new technology and I can solve A through Z, right? Or do something that I couldn't do before. I can help this member. I can make this provider's workflow more efficient if I think use case enablement, right? Operational enablement, as opposed to just what I need to do to check that box, right? That's the wrong way to think about it. Think about use cases as opportunities and game changers and that type of thing. So anyway, that was a long-winded response, but that's the use case piece is critical.
Lorraine.
Well, I agree with everything Patrick said, and so I will take it, and I'm not sure it's up or down a level, but from an implementation internally for all of those things that happen, there are all these other people that actually make those things happen. And I'm going to kind of go backwards from where I was, but those business analysts and the internal policy staff, there's also general counsel. So your legal staff have to be involved, in contracting staff, because there are many other component parts underlying all of the work changes that are going to happen. They also need to be involved in the kinds of things that are going to happen from new systems and services that may have to be implemented. And we've been talking a lot about the customer service staff that are involved, because they're going to be at the front lines. So new standard operating procedures have to be developed. And we've already, kind of been alluding to that a lot, but obviously it's important because it keeps coming up. But strategic planning, we've also referenced the enterprise view. If the strategic planning offices are not involved, then the whole change of the organization won't happen, because they won't even be involved in whatever the new, we call them strategic pillars, but the mission of the organization, the strategic planning team, has to be engaged in that. And then communications. If you're standing up APIs or these new products or these new use cases, the communications team has to be involved and invested in how they're going to put that message out to the patients and to the providers. There's a number of different audiences. So there's these whole operational bodies within the organization that we often forget about, that I think also have, what we consider them in support, that really have to be involved. And we, even at CMS, have implemented, and many of you probably have them, this community of practice that really on fire. And it really has to be a combination of people from both the business and the technical standpoint, and it needs to be driven by the community, not by a talking head, to really understand, what's the challenge, what problems are we trying to solve, what issues can we address jointly, and then that might be something else. So for all the big picture important issues that Patrick was also addressing, what are the kinds of things, challenges that different divisions might be having that they want to know more about, that we could bring to the table and have them discuss jointly, so that the organization is not operating in a silo and can say, oh, you're doing that, but we're also trying to do that. Why don't we try and do that together? And if there's new procedures that have to be done, or contracts that can be done, by the organization writ large, that those are the kinds of, I'll call them lower level, but critically important for the organization to make it work successfully, that I think are also important.
Well, thank you. One of the things that stands out to me in this discussion is those of us who understand APIs and understand the potential that they bring, sometimes operate in our own little world. And when people ask us, please tell me what time it is, or tell me how to use this to tell time, we insist on telling them how the watch is built. And it's, it gets us into, it doesn't help our case very much when we do that. It's, it strikes me that one of the more non-technical issues and roles that might be a key part of this is, like your community of practice, Lorraine, a voice of the customer, whoever, if that's an internal customer or an external customer, be it a patient, a physician, or a health plan, but also, someone who can speak to what transformation this entails and the impact it has without telling people how the watch is built. Someone who can do that. Could you address that? And maybe I'll start with you, Lorraine. And, how do we get people to understand this without boring the daylights out of them, or just confusing them to an endless degree? How do we begin to kind of capture their imaginations?
Well, it's I think personally, it's telling the story of how, how does it's always about me, but in this case, you would say, well, how does it affect you? So how can we, let's say in a community practice, explain what's the impact on how it might be in your life? So how does an API, the inpatient, would it affect you? So it's kind of, I think it's trying to get the person to say, well, how might this affect your life? And frankly, I've been using an example of how an app for diabetes has saved my brother's life 3 times. And if you can put it in the human context and then get people to talk about it from there and then build your way up, I think that's how to at least get people engaged. So first bring it to the human side. So if you're building a watch, well, that's great, good and wonderful, but what does the watch do? It helps you be on time. So if they build the conversation from there, and I think personally that would be the same thing for any of these apps. So a patient access API probably doesn't mean anything to anybody, but if you could say, would you like to know more about how to manage your diabetes so that you don't gain weight or so that you don't die prematurely? Or is there anyone in your family that has a condition, or just say, what conditions do you have in your family? Would you like to help them improve that? It's bringing the conversation to a more human level and then beginning the conversation that way and say, well, here's this information with data that could do that. And then, you know, it's like any conversation, you have to build it from a personal exchange first. And I think you're right with standards, even though standards can be pretty sexy, we forget that because we don't all have our codex rings.
It's true. Patrick, what about your sense of this?
It's a really interesting question, Denny. I'm going to actually tell a story, right? A really quick one, I promise. But I actually lived what you described about 10 years ago. Remember I was getting into FHIR, right? This was maybe pre-version 1.0. And I can remember going into a meeting and I had a deck of, this is what we're going to do with FHIR APIs and all this kind of stuff. And I was so happy with myself and, you know, walked into a meeting and talked about how these APIs were going to, you know, change the way we're going to do business. And as the eyes glazed over in the meeting, right, and people weren't sharing my enthusiasm, I realized I had presented this incorrectly. So I went back after that very unsuccessful meeting. Looks like you may have had one as well in the past. Went back and decided, that was probably not the best way to approach it. Let me align this maybe with solving a real problem. So over the next week, went back to the same people and said, hey, what business problems? Let's partner on solving a real solution, right? Never mentioned FHIR for 2 years. Never mentioned FHIR, but started solving problems with it. I remember the first medication adherence API that built probably 12 years ago at this point, which I think still runs. And it started solving real business problems. And once we started representing, kind of like what Lorraine was saying there, hey, it's not just technology, we're actually moving the ball forward for providers and patients and removing abrasions and getting things in real time and workflow and impacting lives. The conversation completely changed. I still don't think when I started mentioning that it was FHIR, when it started becoming the coolest thing around and everybody had to talk about FHIR, even if you couldn't spell it. When I mentioned, yeah, we solved these use cases, we solved real business problems. Oh, and by the way, we did use that technology. It just made it so much easier. So again, sound like a broken record, but aligning with solving problems and then not advertising or selling on it. It's FHIR-based, but it's solving a real problem. And by the way, you build it once, you can reuse it across the industry. That's how I think you're successful, not because it's a cool API, and they're cool APIs, but they've got to do real work.
Great, thank you. Why don't we move on to our third question for today? Our third question is, what are the top things to consider when trying to expand an existing service designed to meet regulatory requirements to do more than the bare minimum? We have often a regulatory mindset in this industry. How do I check the boxes, Patrick, you said before, how do I achieve quote unquote compliance? And sometimes that sort of requirement is not the real requirement. It's not what we really are trying to do, but it's something that keeps us on the path. Could you talk a little bit about how do you get organizations from a compliance mindset to a business mindset, to a service mindset? And Lorraine, I'll start with you. How do you move past this compliance only to organizations understanding how much more they can do than the bare minimum?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I thought about it a lot. We in our office, in the health informatics office, we love what we are trying to do with this trajectory of, I wish I had another word for interoperability, but for providing people with access to information that can be used for so many purposes. We've all now overused it, the right data to the right person for the right reason, but it's really to change lives. I think that's the bottom line. So when we think about, yes, we have to write regulations because people won't do things unless mommy says so. It's sort of what's the reason that anyone is in the healthcare business is to change lives for the better. And if each of the organizations is really, trying to do something well for that purpose, and these technologies give them the opportunity to do that by improving what they're doing now through these regulations, they could be saving so much time to do that better thing. And so, but to change a mindset, frankly, really requires leadership. So it's not the leaders that are doing this, so it's the implementers. But it's sort of having the vision for that opportunity of how monumental these changes can be. I mean, we have that vision, and that's exciting to us. And so I think it's like bring in someone who's got that kind of vision to say, look at what kind of changes can be made. That's sort of it's really having that inspiring person to go by past the bare minimum, because the regulations are only as good as someone, who's can be implementing them, and at least starting from there. That's just a benchmark. A regulation is really a benchmark, because we're not coming out to find people doing something wrong. We're really trying to find the heroes.
Patrick, what about you? Thank you, Lorraine.
Yep. So building on what Lorraine was saying there, again, if the solution was built for just regulatory compliance, in my humble opinion, that's a bit myopic, but let's say that it was. It doesn't. You still have made the investment in the foundational components for interoperability, right? And once you've made that investment, using that to solve other use cases should be relatively obvious, right? Because you've liberated the data, right? You've democratized the data, you've built the pipes, you've got provenance, you've got a fire server and those types of things. Now it's time, if you haven't already done it, to evangelize within the organization and understand those use cases better. And I'll give you some examples, right? If you've got a fire infrastructure, then talking to your contracting people, Lorraine said this a little while ago, to say, when the contract's coming up for the upcoming year, let's put something in there so that we know what the data sharing is going to look like, especially in value-based care arrangements, right? Where if you don't share data, nobody wins, right? And if you've got it known upfront that we're going to use fire to exchange this, this type of information so that we can do population health on both sides, and we understand what our HEDIS and our STAR scores and those types of things look like, then you start getting additional uptake or additional velocity in an organization. You've built the infrastructure, now it's time to bolt on additional use cases. And from my experiences, once you start getting the contracting folks and the people that are making operational decisions understand that this model of integration interoperability is transformative, and it actually improves scores and it improves lives and those types of things, then you start getting real velocity going forward. So I think it is becomes less of a technical thing because you've got the technical infrastructure, more of a how do you evangelize and advocate inside of the organization? Hey, we've made the investment, right? It's there, it's paid for. Let's use it to our advantage for members, providers, payers, the entire ecosystem, and put it in contracts, put it in discussions, get in front of the value-based care folks. My experience, and we all know this, anytime it's related to value-based care, people listen to you. So closely aligning your use cases and your fire infrastructure with value-based care is a way to expand it across the ecosystem.
Terrific. We have a question from Brian. Does something like blockchain have a role in this sort of process in making information more widely available? Should it be a core part of fire provenance? How does a technology like blockchain, which had its moment several years back and is still a very real technology, but something that people don't think about as much today, do you see blockchain becoming a part of expanding beyond a regulatory focus and making interoperability work even more than people envision? I'll start, Patrick, with you.
Yeah, so this is a great question because as part of an organization that has both fire and blockchain, it is very interesting how the dynamics between the two have kind of swirled around each other. And we've represented fire in blockchain and put fire services on top of blockchain nodes and that type of thing. But that vision has not manifested itself the way that many blockchain advocates would have liked, to your point, several years ago. And I've even got a meeting tomorrow with some of the blockchain folks, Synaptic Alliance, right, to have additional conversations. So do I think that blockchain is a viable technology and does solve problems with provenance? I do. I think there are use cases such as eligibility determinations and other things that are very appropriate that could be used on blockchain. I think that things such as contract and claims processing on blockchain are a little bit aspirational at this point, given the way the industry works. Maybe in 10 years that would be the case. I think there are basic blockchain, or there are use cases that blockchain and fire together can help solve. I think some of the barriers to that, first of all, is that fire solves real problems, right? And it's got traction and it's moving forward, right? So it solves real world problems. Bolting on something like blockchain, although it has certain technical advantages, absolutely, with the way that the security works and the provenance and the immutable nature of the underlying data is very cool. But as of yet, it's not solving, or obvious, it doesn't have the gravity to solve real use cases as of today, right? And if the implementations are going much slower than folks would have hoped, right? I think those that have been in healthcare like myself for a while probably saw that it was going to have some barriers. Do I think over time it will find its way into healthcare? I think it likely will, right? With some basic use cases, some edge cases, eligibility checks, or maybe prior authorization determinations if you can code the rules and that type of thing. But I think it's going to be a slow process. I think fire will continue to be the standard for exchange of information. I think even if it uses blockchain under the covers, going back to what we talked about before, having technology that's cool just for cool sake doesn't really do things. But fire services that solve real business use cases that use blockchain as an underlying repository component, I think will have value over time. But I think the tail is really long on that, to be transparent. So that's my 2 cents.
Lorraine, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. I know that in our specific office, we're not having conversations about it. I don't know if that's the case in the Office of the National Coordinators. In our proposals, we don't have references to it, but it doesn't mean the standards organizations aren't having conversations about it or use. But from a policy perspective, we're not, it's not sort of high on our list right now. And I think that's to the points that Patrick was making.
Yeah, I would just add that I think getting fire right and getting fire in play in an active, an integral part of the flow of data is a precondition, I think, to these distributed architectures. We look at credentialing, or as Patrick said, we look at, where the end user is the steward of their data, and having the end user credential the accuracy and authenticity of their data is something that's very important. But we will need to, I think, get some of the building blocks in place first. But thank you, Brian, for the question. Janice, you have a question. I'll turn it to you.
I do. And before I get to my question, just to follow up, just so folks know, there are some groups that are working on blockchain, both in conjunction with fire and separately. I've worked with some of them. So it is something that is getting some industry effort. So though I wouldn't say they've gone very far. But I actually wanted to ask Patrick in particular, and Lorraine, if she also has any thoughts, because a lot of what we've talked about today has been sort of falls under that rubric of making APIs product-like and involving all parts of an organization. But we've found that there's a real issue in some organizations, especially larger organizations, around communication across business units or groups. We've talked to part of You know, we've talked to people in an organization that we know have implemented fire and been told that they don't have any fire support. You know, how do we break down, as one example of many, how do we break down these types of barriers to get to that holistic approach that we've all talked about being necessary today?
And Janice, did you say fire, they don't have fire support?
Yeah, like we'll talk to one group of people at an organization and we know that we've helped them with fire, and we'll talk to another group of people and they'll be like, oh, we don't do any fire at this organization.
Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail on the head. And sometimes it goes both ways. So you know, at some organizations, fire is so popular that you've got competing fire people, right? They're going to build it. No, we've got it over here, that type of thing. So there does need to be enterprise management, because you don't want 5 fire servers serving up the same information in an organization. That goes back into data governance and enterprise mindset. But also, to your point, you know, that I had the good fortune of kind of being on the leading edge or the leading wave of the fire initiative. And once it got gravity in an organization and people started recognizing, man, this stuff adds real value, the momentum just really picks up. And then the demand for, oh, right, hey, Patrick, can you help us map an observation resource, you know, based upon an HL7 message or whatever the case may be. And you quickly have resource constraints, to your point, Janice. So, and Lorraine talked about this a second ago, I believe it, is setting up, we used to call them centers of excellence, like the Fire Center of Excellence, where we had folks that understood fire resources and understood how our enterprise, you know, data pipelines worked, pushing the information to the fire repository and those types of things. But we did have some, you know, tripping over our own feet a little bit when people were clamoring to map their data into fire, because it's a universal standard. And we're like, we'd love to help you, but our list is, you know, 15 miles long. But once we built up the internal the internal educational level, which actually is not that difficult, then it became you know, much more easier. And I will say just really quickly, because people, and I'll pass it to Lorraine, people think that some people, not so much anymore, think it, oh my God, it's fire is so difficult, these APIs are so difficult. That's not true. Anybody that understands from a technical perspective contemporary RESTful APIs and JSON data structures can be relatively proficient, both from a data perspective and from a technical perspective and from a use case perspective pretty quickly, in my experience. It's not, you know, Hogwarts, it's not dark magic or anything like that. It can be picked up relatively quick. Lorraine?
Oh, dang, I thought it was going to be Hogwarts. I'm disappointed. Sorry, Patrick.
You could make
Lorraine,
it Hogwarts.
We'll make it Hogwarts. We'll call it Hogwarts instead
Yeah.
of fire. Thank Lorraine, turning
Well,
to
I
you.
do think you need that central source, you know, of a place where people can go to reliably get information, and where the initiatives are, at least, you know, in an effort to have a repository of who is doing what, so you don't have silos, and that you can have, you can combine resources and information, so you're not duplicating effort. You know, that sort of that community, whether it's, you call it a center of
Right.
excellence or a community of practice, but I think that's one way to do it. And then get the training in so that everybody has the same information. And, you know, and like we have the health informatics office at CMS, which is supposed to be the place to go to do that, so that all those initiatives and projects can be informed by each other.
Excellent. Thank you. Lorraine Du, CMS, Patrick Murta, BeHaVR. I would want to thank you for a very stimulating and thought-provoking discussion today. We're just about near the top of the hour. And I want to provide our folks in the audience just a brief primer of what's coming next. We're going to have Ryan Howells, Julie Moss, and Kyle Newman joining us for identity and authentication, an essential component of interoperability. And the fire discussion that we've just had is, how do I know how does somebody know who I am, and how do I attest to that in a manner that is conducive and complementary to this type of technology? We're excited to have these experts join us. That will be on Thursday, August 10th at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Finally, to wrap up, again, Lorraine, Patrick, what a great discussion. Thank you so much for your time today. For those of you in the audience who would like to stay a little longer, we've got a 30-minute post-forum meetup. You can stay on this channel and join us at that if you'd like. We're here to answer any further questions you have. For those of you who need to leave, please take a moment to complete the brief survey. And with that, I'll close by again thanking our guests and moving to the final part of the agenda, the post-meeting forum.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Enjoy it. Take care, and we'll talk to you real soon. All right, ladies and gentlemen, those of you who are able to stay, we're happy to answer any questions you might have or discussion points you'd like to review with us. And we'll give folks a few minutes to vote with their feet or not, and we can go from there. First, I'd like to ask my colleague Janice Karen, Janice, for some of your thoughts before we, as we get our folks here on the line to lend their thoughts and their perspectives on this discussion. Any things that you would like to raise?
Yeah, I thought this was a really, really excellent conversation. And one of the things that came up several times that a lot of people don't think about is the role of contracting in interoperability. It's something that we've encountered many times and something that just kind of falls through the cracks. But one of the things that, a lot of the data exchange that's happening right now is actually written into contracts that payers and providers have with each other. And it becomes a barrier to making any changes or adopting any of these things. And whether it's renegotiating contracts or negotiating them better the next time they come up, there needs to be some way to move forward to not just move forward and make changes, but also have mechanisms for doing so that aren't only once every 2 or 3 years. And I think that's my second comment. One thing that did not come up a lot during the conversation, but that I think is pertinent to this discussion, is also the need to be a little bit more agile than people are possibly used to being. These in the world of technology, things change fairly quickly. These regulations are coming at us pretty quickly. And you can't spend 2 or 3 years planning something out and 2 or 3 years implementing it. You need to be able to start doing things within a couple of months, and you need to be able to do a minimum viable and build on it. That's part of why we frame what do you do after the regulation? Because obviously the first goal needs to be meeting the requirements, but there's lots of other things you can do, and that needs to be a process. Sometimes even meeting the regulations is going to be a process where you do that implementation in stages. But changing, it's a business mindset that is pretty common in other industries, but hasn't yet made its way entirely into healthcare. That is probably something that's necessary to be successful at this effort. So I don't know if anyone wants to comment on those thoughts, but I think those are kind of the big things that I would say.
Well, I know for a fact that we have several technologists in our group at this moment, but also, as a consortium, we're looking to advance real-time automated prior authorization across Massachusetts before the end of 2025. And, undertaking a FHIR, an initiative where FHIR is intrinsic to the work requires that we have this agile approach, requires that we release minimum viable products as quickly as possible to assess their what works, what doesn't work, what we've learned, and be able to iterate in order to start delivering value as early as possible, and also to get closer and closer to the product that everyone needs and wants without planning years in advance and taking years to execute. But I know, Janice, you had a question that you wanted to follow up with.
Yeah, I was curious. One of the things that comes with this is sort of identifying. It's not just the other areas of the company and the other business things, but there are other technical pieces that are needed to accompany a FHIR effort, an API effort, an interoperability effort. Some of them are things that we're going to highlight in future sessions. As Denny mentioned, identity and authentication. We'll be talking about security, consent, privacy. Provenance came up during the session, but I was curious if there were specific things that anyone in the audience was really looking at as this is the barrier, this is the thing that we can't figure out, this is the thing that is causing us problems, that is, well, obviously we've identified few, but are there others that we haven't specifically called out that you think are worth addressing or worth discussing? So I'm not to put anyone on the spot, but if anyone on the call has any thoughts on that, I'd be really interested in hearing them.
And please chip in with any comments or questions or responses to Janice's question from anyone in the audience who'd like to, anyone in our forum who would like to add to this discussion.
Well, if you think of anything ongoing, just chime in at that point, because I think that this is the area, I've really been looking forward to this session because I think this is the area that gets the shortest shrift in discussions generally. And it's really an essential area, and having the business processes and the workflows and the culture, there's a lot of company culture that's going to be impacted. People get used to doing things the same way, and there are people who might end up being a little bit, there might be some resistance to change. There might be people who are afraid of having their job duties change or having it affect their livelihood, and there might, and having a compassionate but clear way of addressing that. Well, maybe your duties will change a little bit, but we still have a place for you, or we'll help you train on these other things if a job is going to go away because of things that are changing. Addressing all of those components are really important to being successful as well. And people do, if people are scared, whether that's because of personally or just the resistance to change, or they're used to doing things, having a process for trying to address some of those issues might be one of the most helpful things that you could do to move the organization forward in this area. I don't know if anyone wants to comment on any of that.
Anyone have any comments to share with us on that? I think one of the things that struck me in today's conversation was, in thinking about the work that we have planned as a consortium, are two things. One is the essential, how essential it is to have senior leadership, the CEO, ideally the CEO, being able to express and frame and communicate what this kind of change entails in a way that is meaningful to the organization. Because this is more than a technology transformation, it's a fundamental organizational process and cultural transformation. How do people hear from the person they look to for guidance, whether it's at their department level, their division level, or at the organization level, to answer their questions in ways that they understand? I think that's probably one of the critical things that comes out of this. I think the second thing that I'm certainly going to give some thought to and think about as we prepare our work is, what is a punch list for organizations to assess, and to plug any gaps in their readiness for the adoption of these kinds of transformative technologies, not exclusive to, but including leadership endorsement and communication, close shoulder-to-shoulder customer support or technical support, a new strategy around contracting, a new strategy around partner relations. There's a number of areas where organizations are going to look at this and go, wow, this is going to change a lot about my company. And how do I begin to prepare for that? So that may be something that we'll want to consider as a future discussion for this forum is, what is the organizational punch list that will help leadership, staff, partners understand what's coming and how to best prepare for that. All right, knowing that we have covered a lot and that there is much on people's calendars, I appreciate everyone joining us today. Please join us for next month's forum on identity and authentication. We look forward to having you there to listen to some of the experts we've invited to speak. And with that, I'll let people leave a little earlier today, knowing that no meeting that ends a little early is an unpopular meeting. So thank you all for joining us today. We appreciate your staying around and listening to us discuss, but we'll adjourn for now, and we will see you all next month. Thank you for
Thanks,
joining us.
everyone.